ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom. Shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom. Shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom. Shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom. Shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Please be seated. The first time I encountered anti-Semitism, Jew hatred, was a kid in second grade who called me a dirty Jew. And I slugged him and got sent home from school. So my dad took me to the IHOP for breakfast. And then there was a professor in my sophomore year of college who took Karl Marx a little bit too seriously and believed that Jews were corrupting the world. But since then, anti-Semitism has not affected the choices I make in my life. Not where I live, not where I work, not where I play, not where I work out, not the movies I go to. And that is a remarkable fact of Jewish life in this century, in this moment. Because I may be the member of the first generation of Jews in all of the years of Jewish life to be able to say that anti-Semitism hasn't shaped or misshaped my life. And I thought, and had every reason to believe, that that would be the fact for my kids as well. Until very recently. So this last year, this horrendous event in Pittsburgh, and a synagogue was invaded and 11 people were murdered. And Poway, where someone lost their life. And I have friends who live in Brooklyn who tell me that it's a daily occurrence, that people are beaten, a market in Jersey City, a Hanukkah party in Muncie, and it would appear that the great Jewish nightmare, Jew hatred, has returned again. The infection has set in, the remission has gone away, and we're back wondering, do we belong? And do we belong here? And what is the threat? And what should we do? And who are our friends? And how shall we reach out for help? And this has become something that I know that everyone in the community worries about. Because no matter what kinds of things I've been trying to teach for the last 4 weeks, this is what everybody seems to want to talk about. So tonight I thought we would gather together with two wonderful, insightful authorities to help us understand the current crop of anti-Semitism, what it means, where it came from, what we might do about it, and how this has affected our Jewish life. Please welcome Professor Steve Windmueller. Professor Windmueller, Emeritus Professor of, Jewish Communal Service, at Hebrew Union College, a dear old friend. Steve, in his past life, has worked for the American Jewish Committee, was a Federation director in Albany, New York, holds a doctorate in international relations, and is one of the most insightful scholars of American Judaism that I read regularly and rely on regularly. Welcome, Steve. I'm glad that you can come tonight. And please welcome a new member of our community, Mr. Richard Hirschhaut, who is the new director of the American Jewish Committee here in Los Angeles. Richard, in his past life, came from the Midwest. We will forgive you for that. 21 years on the staff of the Anti-Defamation League, one of the founders of the Illinois Holocaust Museum. He actually, this is an LA thing, he holds an Emmy because he co-produced the movie about Skokie and about what happened in Skokie, and is here representing tonight the American Jewish Committee. And we'll talk about what that organization, what ADL, and the other community organizations do. Richard, it's wonderful to have you with us tonight. So let's begin with the problem at hand. How serious is it? Should we worry? Should our children be worried? I'll tell you that in the synagogue world, you saw two very large men at the gate, both wearing very large weapons on their hips, and there are other security measures that you can't see that are enforced tonight to protect the synagogue. For the very first time that I know of, Valley Beth Shalom asked everyone who came for high holidays to walk through a metal detector. We did that because we were worried. And people were very, very gracious and very patient. And in fact, I apologized to the community for that when we began Rosh Hashanah services, because I didn't want that to be a child's memory of coming to shul. Is it, how important, how powerful, how difficult, how threatening is this new situation? Richard, why don't you begin, and then Steve.
Thank you very much, Rabbi, and it's wonderful
Can you
to
hear
be...
Yeah, that mic's on. It's just not working. Alana, we need a little more juice in the mic if you could.
The mic is on. How's that?
Hang on. Wait. Anti-Semites, they just screw up the mic. Right up next to your mouth, like this.
Thank you very much. How's that? It's good to be with all of you, and this is my first visit to Valley Beth Shalom, and I have always looked at this synagogue, at this beautiful spiritual home, through the lens of the magnificent legacy that Rabbi Schulweis left. And it is something that has inspired me throughout my career, throughout my work in this field of confronting anti-Semitism, and the period that I was blessed to have to help build and establish the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center. That's the first commercial for tonight. If you find yourself in Chicago or with a little time to spare, I highly recommend a visit. It is an uplifting museum that doesn't in any way shirk from the history of that terrible period, but looks at the world with a hopeful glance and a hopeful forward-looking view through the lens of the survivors and the lives that they managed to rebuild. And I mention the museum specifically because if we are to try to identify what really is happening here, and why are we seeing this uptick, borderline epidemic of anti-Semitism, one of the reasons we believe at AJC is that as we move further and further away from the events of the Shoah, it becomes not only ancient history to so many, but it becomes something that many, many young people simply know nothing about, and they have no sense of grounding and perspective and understanding of what that cataclysm brought upon the world and the legacy of that period of time. We can touch a little bit more on that in a moment. I want to just, as part of this opening, share with you that you may have participated, you may have been aware of just 2 days ago, the AJC, American Jewish Committee, launched and really mounted a global campaign through social media, and we'll touch upon the ins and outs of social media over this evening. #JewishAndProud. Now, it might seem almost intuitive or obvious. Why would we need a social media campaign to go forward on the theme of Jewish and proud? Well, it's one way, we believe, of affirming our identity, doing so unabashedly, doing so with an eye toward enlisting others, allies, non-Jews, in appreciating and respecting and nurturing, helping us nurture and celebrate our own identity as Jews. And so literally tens of thousands of people boldly proclaimed their Jewish identity and posted it on social media. Now, we come to this moment in part because of the reaction to the horrific, literally daily attacks in New York over the last 2 weeks. We're not off the hook here in Los Angeles, but in New York, not a single day of Hanukkah passed without a grotesque, severe anti-Semitic episode, culminating, of course, on the seventh night when the machete-wielding assailant, filled with hate, entered the rabbi's home in Muncie. And so this comes on the heels of those events, but it also takes us a little further back. It takes us to a survey that AJC conducted on the eve of the one-year anniversary of Pittsburgh. And let's make no mistake, Rabbi, you are correct. When we talk about Pittsburgh and Poway that followed 6 months later, that was, for all intents and purposes, a game changer for the American Jewish community. We knew about Europe. We've seen attacks. We've witnessed those attacks. We've suffered with our brethren overseas. But in America, we never would have imagined it. Post-Pittsburgh, as we move toward that one-year anniversary, AJC did a telephone polling, a survey, more than 1,200 respondents nationally, and there were some very troubling signs that emerged. 25% of the American Jews who were surveyed, who were polled, now it's not necessarily a complete sampling, but it's a representative sampling of the community, were uncomfortable publicly displaying any semblance of their Judaism. Think about that. To wear a kippah, a Star of David, whatever it might be, uncomfortable doing that. 31% were uncomfortable going to physically entering a Jewish institution, a recognizably Jewish institution. These are very, very disturbing statistics, and it speaks to a level of anxiety and unease that we need to confront in this country. So I want to open really just by saying, no, the sky is not falling, but there are clouds, and there is some rumbling, and there is some thunder in the skies, and we need to get in front of it as a community, as community relations organizations, and as a collective. And that's what begins in part, in no small part, this evening, and what we need to carry forward. I'll stop at that moment.
Steve, how worried should we be?
I think, as with Richard, this is a situation that is fundamentally different for American Jews than we have seen before. The rise of social media that Richard also referenced is particularly important because historically the American Jewish community was able to galvanize its political support from elites and core organizations in education, religion, business, civic affairs, and ethnic communities. Those relationships were critical. Sorry, you're going to feel very intimate with this microphone. Falling in love. These elite leaders and institutions were the buffers. They defined messages about Americanism, about pluralism, about engagement. Those messages and those elites do not work in 21st century social media terms. We are no longer able to count on the Chamber of Commerce leader, the core religious personality, the major black influential, the congressperson representing a key congressional district. That has been lost in part because the independent actors that we now see as playing out their hatred are not responsive to or responding to the kinds of leaders that had once held sway over public opinion and social behavior. So that's the first principle. The second has to do with the fact that religion in America, which was a core glue for much of the 20th century in defining the Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish symbolism of brotherhood and interfaith relationships. And while we may think of that as an old and not necessarily valid notion, the fact is it was a powerful concept in much of the religious and cultural life of America in the central decades of the 20th century. That is no longer holding, because religion in America has also lost its place. The rise of the religious nuns, the higher rates of disaffiliation, and we see that, by the way, also within American Judaism, is reflected in the various changes that I think are reflected in what we are witnessing in this country. The third element is tied to the fact that America demographically is so changing. The rise of Latino Americans, of Asian Americans as key players in the ethnic mix of American society has fundamentally changed the character of America. By the year 2043, Islam will replace Judaism as America's third major religion. And by the year 2050, the United States will no longer be a white majority society. Now, all of that data is not simply known to the establishment. It is known to the alt-right, and it is understood by the enemies of the State of Israel and the Jewish community on the left as fully appreciative of the fact that this may be the last opportunity for Jews to, in a sense, have some effect or influence in the kind of discourse that has defined much of the conversation in this country. And don't misunderstand the fact that the Jewish community, despite its size, is clearly a very influential component of American social ideas, economic practice, and political values. And we see that in the context of the number of Jews who are playing roles in the public square and in the civic community. That high degree of presence, which is a blessing, has now become, in a sense, a threat and challenge. Because the high profile of Jews, whether around the issue of impeachment, or the question of the State of Israel, or the question of American globalism, all of these factors, I think, weigh in the changing modalities of how people think about and what they want for the United States in a very changing society. So each of these factors, the decline of the ability of the influentials to control and define the context of the debate, the changing demographics in this society, the changing political characteristics of how and where Jews have been seen and how they are seen, and the changing realities of the American story will all seem to come before us at a moment in which I think we are witnessing these expectations and elements of anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish behavior.
I want to, thank you. I want to go a little bit deeper into some of the causes, because one of the things that's surprising, one would have assumed that it would take an economic downturn. It would take a major foreign incursion. It would take some great crisis to raise up this hatred out of the basement of American culture. But more or less, the economy is prosperous. More or less, until last night, the country's more or less at peace. The question is, why now? You've suggested the loss of influence of a certain class of influencers. You've talked about some of the demographic changes. What now? What is it that caused this to happen now?
I believe we are living in a moment of tremendous incivility. There is a coarseness in our culture. I think back to, and I've had the great benefit and blessing of working in the community relations arena my entire career for, I want to say close to 40 years, but I think I'll say more than 30 years. It just makes me feel better. But I think back to maybe 20 plus years ago, even in the political arena. I was with the ADL at the time. AJC did something very similar. Usually at the outset of an electoral cycle, it would be very customary, very routine for the ADL, for AJC, to reach out to the different candidates for public office, to ask them all individually and collectively to agree to a set of principles, not to appeal in a base fashion to prejudice, to ethnic division, to racial division, and to effectively conduct a clean campaign that was intended to involve all people in a thoughtful discussion, ultimately leading to informed decisions at the ballot box. How quaint that seems today. The notion that you would approach a political candidate and ask them to sign something like that, let alone read the document. And that speaks, I think, in many ways to the decline in the way we talk to each other, in the way we relate to each other. And some of that onus, frankly, is on our own community. You know, here in Los Angeles, for many, many years, and what was, I think, not included in Stephen's illustrious bio, is that he served as the executive director of the JCRC, the Jewish Community Relations Council. If you were to attempt to reach out to the JCRC in Los Angeles today, you would be out of luck. It no longer exists. It is, in many ways, unfathomable to me, as a Jewish communal professional, that we don't have that common table within our own community. And this is not blaming the victims for their victimization, but it's suggesting to you the kind of platforms that we need to have in our community. We may not all agree, and certainly today likely would not agree. The positions, the elbows have gotten sharper and the positions have become much sharper, but just conceptually, the idea that there's a town square, if you will, that there's a place for the alphabet soup of Jewish organizational life to come together and everybody's an equal in that room. You've got the mainstream organizations and you've got some that are well endowed, and then you've got the folks who are doing it on a shoestring. But at that table, around that table, everybody is an equal. We don't have that anymore in this community. And I think that is to our detriment, because it was that umbrella of a JCRC that allowed us to build bridges and reach out and create olive branches with other communities, and to establish alliances and coalitions and relationships that serve the test of time. And so LA is not the only community that has jettisoned that structure. Others have. I think we need to bring it back. That's just one prescriptive that I would offer this evening.
So Richard has stolen my thunder.
I'm sorry.
But clearly that we can come back to sort of prescriptions for how to remedy and move us forward as a community, and that may be certainly one that is necessary. What was also reflected in the document that Richard referred to about the AJC study, I think over 80% of those surveyed said that they were concerned about anti-Semitism. And in a study just completed here in Los Angeles by the Pat Brown Institute at Cal State Los Angeles, that study shows 83% of LA's Jewish community believe anti-Semitism is real, it is threatening, and it is dangerous. So I think, Rabbi, what this suggests is that the communities here and elsewhere are in a situation where they need to figure out what they can do, what we can do, to begin to reaffirm some of the relationships that we have historically held, and to build new ones with new constituencies. But I think we have to step back for a few moments to look at a couple of other interesting realities. David Nierenberg, who is the dean of the University of Chicago's Divinity School, has just written in the New Yorker a fascinating piece in which he describes the fact that Christianity and Islam have laid out over centuries their case against Judaism. And while in the 20th century we moved a great deal further in remedying many of these issues, especially with the Catholic Church, the reality is that many of the ideas as framed in these theologies were rejectionists of Jews and Judaism. And one doesn't simply lose that. One doesn't simply see that dissipate. And that what he has argued is that much of what we are seeing today in anti-Semitism globally, but also here in the United States, is framed in the context of a religious belief and religious ideologies about Jews and Jewish history. So you actually don't need Jews to have anti-Semitism, as we've certainly learned. And what we have come to understand through Nuremberg's thinking and others is that the idea that a religious faith is somehow conspiratorial in its character. Now, the conspiracy theories about Jews are really much more a 20th century phenomenon, although they had their origins in the Middle Ages and certainly at various other historic moments. But combining theology with conspiracy, according to Nuremberg, suggests that there are reasons to believe that Jews are powerful, that Jews are influential, that Jews are globalists. And by being globalists, they have changed the economy. They are changing the norms, the values of a society, and that they are in a kind of cohort of remaking the world. And so for the alt-right, if you look at their literature, they're precisely pushing back against all of these notions about the sort of power and influence and positioning of Jews. Jews are not white, they would argue, because they are seeking to usurp our whiteness. But likewise on the left, the same elements who are looking at the conspiracy of the American-Israel relationship as somehow driving the American foreign policy establishment and being the central piece to the Trump administration's views on the world, that too has a problematic character to it as well. That Jews are too white, that we have become too powerful, that we are seen as too establishment, and therefore we do not fit any longer in the coalitions with other minorities because we have become part of the majority. So between this religious historic fanaticism and conspiratorial ideologies and ideas, I think these then have become other factors in creating the threats and challenges to who we are and how we appear before other groups.
I want to unpack that a second. So on the right, you have an extreme voice on the right, which sees Jews, I think the conspiracy is what they call replacement theology, replacement theory, which is Jews are orchestrating an organized program to bring people of color, and often non-Christians, in order to take the place of what that movement believes is authentic American, which is white and Christian. So the guys in Charlottesville chanted, "Jews will not replace us." That's that theory. You hear that? And on the left, on the extreme left, you have a counterpart, which in some ways is its mirror image, but in some ways it's its counterpart, in which Israel plays that role. The Jew on the right is a fantasy of this powerful globalist. And on the left, for the left, Israel is this fantasy of this powerful force, which is, first of all, corrupting the Middle East and eventually corrupting America. So you have in these two different camps, completely diametrically opposite in every way except one, their common hatred for Jews. So the two places where you find Jew hatred most virulent is in these cells on the alt-right and on American university campuses, which give harbor to voices on the extreme left. You got that right so far? So now let's take one of the factors that's different, which is social media. Because in the old days, I'd have to go to a meeting and they would radicalize me. But today, I can sit in my basement with my computer, and and radicalization can happen that way. There was a wonderful speech, which you should go online and look up. Sacha Baron Cohen, who was the comedian, was given an award by the ADL? By the ADL New York. And he made a wonderful talk, and he actually echoed a little bit in his Golden Globes presentation against Facebook, of all things. Because he said this unregulated power to spread anything has become a real danger to the democracy, What is the power of social media, and what is its effect on this, and what do we do about it? Who'd like to start?
Go for it.
I'll take a stab at that. Sacha Baron Cohen's speech was magnificent, and he did not pull any punches. He talked about I think he referred to them as the Silicon Six, the major internet platforms and providers taking a complete hands-off approach to any checks and balances on content that appears on these sites. Now, we've had a whole other dimension of this when we think about the tampering with the American electoral process, and that's another weakness and Achilles heel that has been exposed through these companies. But fundamentally, and it's a very interesting and really a global conversation, because when we think of Silicon Valley and all of these platforms, they're not just reaching Americans, but they are all over the world. In Europe, where hate speech is actionable and can be punished criminally, this is really where many of the countries, Germany and France and others, are holding these internet companies, these internet service providers, and these platforms, taking them to task and holding them accountable and saying to them they need to clean up their act, or else they will not have the ability to operate in those countries. And that's a very, very powerful tool. Now, of course, we're not able to apply that same standard in America because the First Amendment is sacrosanct. But this should never really be a conversation about the First Amendment. It should be a conversation about corporate social responsibility. And it should be a conversation about these companies understanding the tremendous power and influence that they wield and doing something proactively about it. I learned recently that Facebook, for example, actually employs some 13,000 people whose job is to do nothing but expose those who are trying to exploit that platform for evil and for no good. They may need to hire more people. There's no question about it. This is an ongoing conversation, and there is going to have to be a certain reckoning with all of this. Now, to your point, Rabbi, you're absolutely right. 25 years ago, before the advent of the internet, you would have to, if you wanted to show your interest or fealty to a particular hate group, you'd really have to show up. You would have to physically show up at the Holiday Inn down the road, wherever their meeting was taking place. Today, you've got this virtual community so that people that may have been typically lone wolves of hate, the lone wolf perpetrator and hater, is now cushioned by and surrounded by this virtual family of support. And it creates, of course, a certain anonymity. And I bring this back again to the corrosiveness of our culture. And we see it in so many different ways. Sometimes people are inflammatory in their emails. Sometimes people are inflammatory in their social media posts. Would you ever talk to another human being the way some of those posts are written, the way some of those emails are written? Of course not. And so this is a serious, serious challenge for us. We have to work with these internet companies, and we absolutely are doing this at AJC. I know the ADL is doing it as well, and we all have to be involved in this effort. But the other thing that has to happen is when, and this comes back to how we create deterrence against anti-Semitism. We need tougher hate crime laws, and we have to make sure that the perpetrators of hate crimes, and more often than not they are young people, and you don't want to just lock them up and throw away the key. You want to hope that there is some rehabilitative and affirming and positive life path that they may pursue. But the penalties for their crimes need to be more severe. They need to be more harsh. That needs to be a deterrent to others against perpetrating hate crimes. And we've seen a little too much of a revolving door and a little too much of a slap on the wrist approach to hate crime. And so we need to work within our system, within our democracy, to strengthen the laws, to make sure law enforcement themselves are trained and sensitive. There was a fascinating article in the New York Times just right after the New Year about the hate crimes unit in the LAPD and how they've reclassified anti-Semitic crimes. And what had been, it led to a spike that resulted, but a spike that is instructive to us. Until they reclassified, if a swastika was painted on a synagogue, God forbid, it was treated as an anti-Semitic episode. If that same swastika was scrawled on a park bench, a public park bench, it was treated as graffiti. Now they are indistinguishable. It is anti-Semitism. And that's part of what we have to do to raise the level of awareness and help people understand that this is serious, that those symbols carry power and cannot be simply scrawled with impunity.
As you probably know, on Sunday in New York, some 25,000 folks participated in a collective gathering to basically speak out against hate and express the notion that Jews were committed to fighting and standing together. But more quietly and probably far more importantly, there have been a series of meetings not only in New York with law enforcement, but here in Los Angeles and around the country in galvanizing public authorities, in working with the Jewish communities, in dealing with measures, as the rabbi referred to at the outset, about security and upgrading of security. New York, for example, will increase its security budgets to assist synagogues, Jewish schools, and other institutions by some huge amount, some $360 million compared to the $45 million that was allocated this past year. And we are likely to see similar efforts across the board and on the federal level. Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois introduced into the Senate in yesterday's session a first draft of a domestic terrorism piece of legislation. It is co-sponsored in the House as well, designed to begin to look at the question of defining anti-Semitism as a form and piece of domestic terrorism. So we're going to look at that piece of legislation. When I say we, I'm speaking here generically, that I believe the American Jewish community will take very seriously, and the national agencies will explore the benefits as well as the challenges associated with such legislation. As we know, sitting in the House, a very interesting piece of legislation, the Holocaust Education Act. Now, as far as I know, it remains not yet introduced for action in the Senate. We are aware that numerous Jewish organizations have been supportive of this, believe it's an educational strategy designed to strengthen the forms and means by which Holocaust education and other forms of introducing Jewish learning and understanding about Jews is conveyed to public educational audiences. And Richard, if you know more about the legislation or its standing, I'm happy to have you talk about it. But it's yet another expression of trying to find ways to use the available resources, whether it's police and FBI and security, or whether it involves the congressional frames of sources available to us.
I'm very encouraged to hear more about the bill, and I'm certain that AJC will be supportive of it. I think we have to return to basics in many ways. We have to double down in investing in public education, in valuing the role of teachers, and appreciating the crucial and central role that they play in shaping the character and the kind of future leadership we will have in this country. So public education has always been of value for the American Jewish community. And we can speak to myriad successes and rags to riches stories, if you will, of how that pathway has enriched our country. We have to find ways to stand together as a nation of immigrants, and we sometimes forget that those who are seeking safe harbor and seeking asylum from persecution in their native lands are indeed looking to the light of America as a place to find that safe haven and to contribute to our society. And one of the corrosive effects, in my humble opinion, I can't speak for AJC here, but just from my own observations through the years, one of the corrosive and toxic effects of a disdain for immigrants is that America is weakened. And there does sometimes become a sense of open season and fair game on minorities in this country because of how we view others from outside. And that's something we have to work on. We have got to find ways to reinvigorate the historic alliances that brought us to prosperous times, that brought us to being a society that is more harmonious and appreciative of our diversity. The T word, tolerant and tolerance, is often bandied about. That's really a least common denominator. We have to do a lot better than that. I was in Sacramento yesterday in a meeting with the State Superintendent of Education because there is a proposed model ethnic studies curriculum that is being put forward for the state of California. And the first iteration of that curriculum, a draft which was prepared largely in secret, was a colossal, disastrous surprise to most of us in California. And so this was perhaps my welcome to California moment. But it's going to be fixed, and it's going to be better. And this was an opportunity to meet with the senior-most educational leadership of this state to try and craft a model curriculum that is reflective of the diversity of this state. I think back to my early ADL days, and we always used to think about and put forward and postulate, in the year 2020, America will look like X, Y, and Z, and California will look like, and here we are, folks. This is exactly what I shared with the superintendent yesterday, who happens to be African American and Jewish, and is a very interesting, Tony Thurmond, a very, very interesting individual. And obviously what we do in California tends to blow eastward. That we are the trend setters for this country, and that adds a little more pressure on all of us, but we've been up for the challenge before, and we need to do so again.
Let's pursue that just a moment. Stephen, you suggested that some of the social trends which are pushing people toward hate include the growing diversity of American population and growing cultural diversity of American life and a sense of change in the air. As well, we could add the economic changes that are coming with the advent of artificial intelligence, which will begin to replace many of the sort of I don't say menial jobs, because that's a pejorative, but this unskilled labor will be taken over more and more by machines. and people of that social group are going to find themselves in a more difficult position finding jobs. And that's coming, and it's coming very quickly. Both the diversity of the culture, the diversity of the population, the change in the more globalized economy, which is here, but becoming even more so. What are the countervailing forces, besides an education bill? What are the countervailing forces that we can call upon to help us enforce a sense of solidarity and tolerance and community, as opposed to hunkering down in our ethnic enclaves and pushing out each other?
I think that a good deal of what is ahead for us is the reestablishment of core relationships that the Jewish community historically had with various institutions, with various ethnic and racial and religious communities. And there are new ones, many new ones, and they require our attention, because we've always understood as a community that our well-being as a Jewish community, as American Jews, was tied to people buying in and believing in the American ethos, the American story. And whether it's the story of being generations of immigrants, or understanding America as this extraordinary cultural and economic phenomenon, or whether it's understanding it in the context of the first set of amendments to the Constitution, it's understood to us as a community that our security was tied to the fact that other Americans needed to buy the American story. And that's the question at the moment, whether enough Americans really believe in the system. And I raise that in the context of the fact that every study suggests that the Congress of the United States, the courts of the United States, the presidency of the United States, and you just name the institutions, have all lost their luster, have all lost the support and the passion and the belief in the value and the purpose of these kinds of institutions. Now, where we may hold that some of these institutions are in trouble, and where we may believe that certain policies and practices are not the ones we would prefer, that is very different from giving up on the Congress, or giving up on the court system, or on the American presidency. And so the first task is helping to figure out ways that we can transmit this sort of passion for and belief in the American story, which is our story, but it's also their story, to find ways to recreate those connections. Part of that is voting. Now, we vote. American Jews vote in extraordinarily high numbers. We were voting as high as 85% of American Jews voting. That number has actually dropped. And in 2016, surprisingly, a number of folks simply sat out the 2016 election based on a Brandeis University study, which was fascinating, about millennials, because Bernie's Jewish millennials, many of them, 10% of them, stayed home because their person wasn't on the ballot. So this creates an interesting challenge for us, but it's a much larger challenge for Americans. Roughly 57% of eligible voters voted in 2016. Now, when Richard Nixon and John Kennedy ran for president in 1960, that number was considerably higher, and yet we have seen since 1960 that Americans have begun to drop away from the ballot box. Now, in a few elections, that number went back somewhat toward the 60-65 percentile, but we are one of the larger democracies in the world with one of the lower voter turnouts in the world. And this is a challenge as well, because if people are not voting, they are not declaring themselves in terms of their belief in and commitment to the American political process. That is our responsibility as well, to ensure that not only our community votes, but that Americans eligible to vote do so. The third factor is that I think we have to understand the fact that in our schools, civic education, the civics classes, we all took American history, we all took courses in how government works. Well, that's not necessarily the case any longer. As schools economize, they downsize in some of these critical areas. And we, as core believers in public education, have to make sure that our kids and the kids from all other sectors of our society are exposed to the kinds of learning about the system, its history, its failures, and its promise. An additional point to consider is that when Richard mentioned that the JCRC, the CRC in this community no longer exists, it, along with the ADL and the American Jewish Committee and other institutions, were able to create the kinds of networks of relationships with these civic and ethnic and racial communities. So we need to recreate in some fashion in this community an effort that will allow the AJC to sit at that table and permit its strength and the strengths of the ADL and our synagogues and our other national and local institutions work in collective engagement in community building, which is an essential piece to what I believe ought to be the responsibility of the Jewish community, to be active in ways that hold these relationships together. I would think over the last 20 to 25 years we've become somewhat lazy. We were lazy in the context that we believed that we had made it, and indeed American Jews have clearly been successful. But we somehow forgot along the way to bring along with us the other partners and to create the relationships and sustain those relationships with the Catholic Church, with Latino leaders, with Asian American groups, with African American groups, and with a host of new and arriving communities and constituencies that we haven't even yet met, that are part of greater Los Angeles. This is the center of diversity. And if we don't create that sort of model of community building, we have left ourselves and our children a vacuum of significant and historic proportions.
I want to pursue this a second. A lone shooter, a lone machete-wielding fellow, is radicalized online and goes on his own to carry out revenge against Jews. But that person is also affected by the culture that he or she belongs to. The ethnic culture, the religious culture, the political culture they belong to. So let's take a moment and ask, I want you to help us understand, one of the shocking things about the Muncie attack and the Jersey City attack was that the attacker was African American. Now, the Jews, if you ask Jews, do Jews and African Americans see the world eye to eye? Jews all say, yeah. We remember Martin Luther King and Abraham Heschel. We remember Schwerner and Goodman, and we remember these iconic civil rights moments. But does the African American community, as a community, to the extent that we can speak about an African American community and a culture, does that community see a solidarity with Jews in these issues? Or have the economic and political issues divided us so that they really see each other in very different terms? And then I'm going to ask you about every other American ethnic group, so get ready.
I would say that it's very important that you raise this point, because when we look at coming back to really the subject matter for this evening, this why now, why anti-Semitism, and where is it coming from? What's happened in New York in recent weeks does not fit into that paradigm necessarily. This is not the extreme right. This is not the radical left. This is not Muslim extremism inspired anti-Semitism. There have been numerous attacks, certainly Muncie and Jersey City, and some connection with Jersey City to an extremist organization known as the Black Hebrew Israelites. They have nothing to do with Hebrew and they have nothing to do with Israel, but it is an extremist organization. But several of the other attacks that took place a Jewish person being tackled to the ground 2 blocks from Grand Central Station, other assaults that have happened in Brooklyn have come from African Americans. And there's a disturbing trend line there, and it's something that requires, where there is a sense of connection and enlightenment and historical bond from the African American community, it requires some overture of support and understanding from that community. There is one such example that is in process right now here in Los Angeles. You may know the name of Bishop Ken Ulmer. Bishop Ulmer is with the Central Faithful Baptist Church. I may be misappropriating the nomenclature a little bit. This is the church that bought the old Forum in Inglewood. Bishop Ulmer fills that building. I think he's in a different building now. But on a bad day, on a bad Sunday, he'll have 5,000 people in
Same here at VBS.
in the pews. So. Right, it's very similar. It's a very close sort of
Sunday. We'll get
neck and neck. Bishop Ulmer frequently brings his congregants, his parishioners to Israel. He just returned a month ago from a small mission in which he brought only 70 people to Israel. He brings hundreds every year, and he has been in pain over what he has seen and what has transpired. And he will be organizing a solidarity rally at his church on Sunday, January 19th, which happens to be the Martin Luther King Memorial Weekend, 3 o'clock in Inglewood, and we can get the information to everybody. And the Jewish community needs to show up. He wants us to show up because he wants his parishioners to see us and to understand us and to lock arms with us. That's part of what has to happen. As much as we need to reach out, it has to be a little bit reciprocal sometimes. And with a Bishop Ulmer, we have a remarkable partner for good. One other area to share, and just a comment on the rabbi's remark about the historic alliance. That historic alliance may also seem like ancient history to many in the African American community. And I believe we have to find different ways of connecting. I don't know if the name Nipsey Hussle means anything to this. I see many heads nodding. And the legacy of this extraordinary man is absolutely riveting. Front page of the LA Times this past Sunday was about the book clubs that exist in many cities that were inspired by Nipsey Hussle, this rapper who was tragically gunned down less than a year ago and has touched the lives of thousands. His funeral, his memorial service, was held in the Staples Center, and they filled the house. And all the different warring and competing gangs and factions in LA put it all to the side because they were there to pay homage to Nipsey Hussle. There's a foundation that's been established in his memory to try to provide vocational opportunities and educational opportunities to young people. These are the places where the Jewish community needs to be. When there's an opportunity to help with tutoring and with mentoring and with entrepreneurial skill building, this isn't patronizing. This is helping. This is building relationships. And that's a whole other point of entry. In many respects, what Bishop Ulmer is doing, which is so remarkable, is in many ways the exception. That's not really where the rank and file can be found. And in terms of the kinds of relationships and enduring relationships that we want to create, this is what has to happen. 3 weeks ago, again, I'm doing my tour of LA, I made my first foray into Compton. And what was striking to me, I went to a meeting of the Neighborhood Housing Association. It's a city-supported agency, and many of their interfaith partners were coming together for a briefing. And where was this held? This was held in a beautiful, multi-purpose, colorful, welcoming facility that is intended to be a one-stop shop for people trying to lift themselves out of the grip of poverty. And what was particularly compelling to me was that this was the morning after the evening before, so just back up about 12 hours, AJC held its annual Hanukkah party for the diplomatic corps and other and elected officials and other friends of the organization. And we held it this year. Usually it's in a banquet hall or a synagogue social hall. This year we went to what was previously the Zimmer Children's Museum, the Jewish Children's Museum in the Federation Building, that in August opened a beautiful new facility at Santa Monica Place. Great location, fantastic setting. The kids loved it, the adults loved it, and it was such a beautiful, welcoming, and colorful place. And 12 hours later, when I walked into this community center in Compton, I felt like I was walking into the Caton Children's Museum yet again. These are the places where we need to be. This is how we need to extend ourselves and build different kinds of relationships than we may have had 40 or 50 years ago when they were important and they were relevant and they had sustenance. We've got to look at it very, very differently because the times continue to evolve and change. But we have to have allies and partners in this fight against hate. Anti-Semitism, to Stephen's point very correctly, is not just a Jewish problem. It's a problem for all of humanity.
Richard, you only have 81 more cities to go to in Los Angeles County, so you're well on your way.
Trying.
The reality of what I'm about to say suggests that there's a very distinct difference between the relationships in this city with African Americans and Jews than with the relationships we find in New York. And I think we need to understand that. Some of you will recall Crown Heights and the events that occurred in the 1990s associated with Rabbi Schneerson and communities of African Americans at the time. Unfortunately, the seeds of that event and the relationships between the communities has never been really dealt with. That the New York Jewish community, in a sense, dismissed Crown Heights and never really did the kind of serious work associated with building and sustaining these relationships. So we have the experiences of what we're now living with as a part of that outgrowth, of that history. We also have, as part of that history, the reality that you have fundamentally different kinds of African American communities living in greater New York, different from the ones that are here on the West Coast. And part of that is the context of their relationships to the Caribbean, to Africa, to Latin America, and elsewhere. And part of it is tied also to their engagement with Jews. Because in New York, the engagements with Jews were often contentious, and it was about relationships of landowner to renter. It was about store owners to constituencies, to customers. And the connections in Los Angeles are fundamentally different in terms of both the economies and the players. One other point about New York that we need to clarify. The New York Police Department released yesterday the data, which we would like to get more from them in terms of the breakout of hate expressions, of hate practice. But 60% of crimes against Jews in New York are committed by whites, 60%. And only 30%, although significant, but the media would have you believe this is a black Jewish issue in New York, and the reality is that the numbers don't necessarily give us that same trajectory and outcome. The work that has been done elsewhere in the United States in terms of building these coalitions with African American leadership that was just described in South Central and in Compton are really critical to what has to happen in every American community with all of the different ethnic groups.
I want to close our conversation by talking about us. We've spent a lot of time talking about them and those who hate and what we can do about populations and cultures that foment that hate. I'd like to talk about the reaction that we have to this. I don't know if you know this, but Jews tend to worry. You probably knew that. And worry becomes a tremendous power. Fear is a tremendous power within the Jewish soul. We have deep instinctual memories of destruction. And these kinds of events, they touch those wounds very deeply. And they excite that worry. I was at Trader Joe's, which is a Jewish institution here in the Valley. And there was a member of the congregation who saw me there and recognized that I'm the rabbi and said, you know, Rabbi, I'm listened to all this news about all this anti-Semitism, and I'm frankly afraid to come to shul. So I assured this person that nothing bad would happen except you won't like the kugel maybe, but you know, you can come to shul. I didn't say something like, you know, you didn't come to shul before, but I didn't say that. But that would have been mean. I was thinking that, but I didn't say that. I said, you can come to shul. It's okay. I mean, it's cool. What does it do to us? This conversation has now taken the headlines in Jewish periodicals. This conversation has taken the headlines in our community meetings, in sermons. Every rabbi in America gave the sermon that I gave. I know this because they copied it from me, but they all gave the same sermon based on Barry Weiss's book on anti-Semitism and Deborah Lipstadt's book on anti-Semitism. And we all gave them, and Poway and Pittsburgh, and these are things that become now part of our vernacular. But that warps Jewish life. It steals our hope. It steals our faith. It does things to Jewish children. What is it doing to us, and what do we need to do about that? Go ahead, one of you guys.
Well, I think it has the potential to be destructive, but it also has the opportunity to be engaging and creative in the sense that Jews can find, for the first time in a while, the necessity of coming together and learning how to talk with one another, to create the discourse that we haven't had in the last number of years because we disagree over politics, Israel, and a host of other issues. And we have to find ways to re-enter the conversation with one another. There is concern that anti-Semitism will create certain negative behaviors or reactions on the part of Jews, that some Jews will stay away. We know from the 1930s that some Jews changed their names and refused to wear the garb of their Jewish identity, kippot or Stars of David or other such identifying symbols. We also know that there were Jews who went out of their way to actually discount and marginalize and minimize Jews and Judaism as a way to sort of reference themselves as other. But we also know that it was a time of extraordinary community gatherings where people came together precisely because they were scared and precisely because they wanted to make a difference and precisely because they were looking for answers of what can we do now. So I think that those are all the possibilities. We've been concerned about the fact that many younger Jews are disconnected and part of the religious nuns and part of a culture that
I just want to define that. It's not N-U-N-S.
Yes.
I don't think of like ladies in habits with schmantas on. No, it's when asked on a survey, what is your current religion? 30% of young Americans check the box labeled none.
So,
not Christian, not Jewish, not Muslim, not Hindu, not Buddhist, none. That's what he means when he says religious nuns.
I'm sorry.
Because people are going to call me tonight and say, what does he have against Catholics? He keeps talking about nuns. That's what he's talking about. Is that okay? I'm sorry, Stephen. Go ahead.
I appreciate that. If there are other words that I use, please clarify for the audience. So this opportunity to realize that younger American Jews may be asking questions about being Jewish in this day and age, when they are suddenly seeing and experiencing and feeling the sort of tenseness and the outcomes of anti-Semitic behavior, then this may be an opportunity to see a kind of re-engagement, reconnection in some form, and that will be an interesting phenomenon to study and to observe. I think that religion in America goes through these cycles where we've seen periods of great rebirth of religious life. We saw it after the Civil War. I wasn't around, Rabbi, but I know it happened. Why do you think the Reform movement came into being? It was a post-Civil War expression of American Judaism. That's another topic for another day.
Right.
But we saw it again in the 1920s and 30s, and we may again see it in this century in the context of people looking for community. I mean, there is such a loss of institutional connection and identity. Rotary clubs, PTAs, Hadassah groups, and other institutions, including synagogues, are all experiencing this sort of falling away of members, except at VBS. So I think that it's important to look at the question of whether or not, sometimes out of negative experience, community building and community re-engagement may happen.
I want to share an example. There's a conversation that I will be having very soon with a woman from the East Coast. Her name is Marnie Feinberg. She is the daughter-in-law of a woman named Joyce Feinberg, who was among the 11 worshipers at Tree of Life Synagogue who were murdered on October 27th of 2018. And Marnie Feinberg approached one of my colleagues, our Washington, D.C. director, with an idea and a project that she is looking to promote. And the idea is that when we hold our Passover Seders this year, invite two people to share in your holiday meal who are non-Jews, who may be neighbors, who may even be just acquaintances, to join in the celebration, to share and to learn and to understand, and to do this little by little, incrementally, and to begin to build some greater sense of connection and community, the kind of community model that Stephen has spoken of. That's part of it. I do think to the question of how will this shape the way we look at the world and look at anti-Semitism. There was a very powerful piece in the Times of Israel just a few days ago by Daniel Hartman, the head of the Shalom Hartman Institute. And the subject of his essay was, "I hate talking about anti-Semitism." And he went through all of the reasons why he views the discussion and the talk about anti-Semitism as negative and as obscuring the promise of Jewish life and the opportunity to flourish in Jewish life. And he went through his whole litany, and then he reached just a very profound turn where he said, "But." And the but was that we have to work through this difficult period, that there is no turning away from confronting anti-Semitism and from helping others understand it and from ensuring that the laws on the books are strengthened and that we're teaching about it and that we are engaging others in understanding that anti-Semitism is a symptom of a larger malady and virus and disease that ultimately affects and consumes all of society. And so Daniel Hartman, the ultimate optimist and pursuer of Jewish wisdom and illumination, took a little bit of a time out. Sometimes we have to get to the basics to try to push through the hate. And so 2 other quick thoughts. One, on the heels of the survey that AJC did, we've come out with, and this will be, we'll be turning this into a teaching model, a glossary called Translate Hate. And this is essentially a glossary of 24 of the more well-known, time-worn tropes and anti-Semitic canards, and it breaks them down. Where does it come from? How has it been used to denigrate and to hurt and offend? And by hopefully understanding this and teaching about it, we can create some greater understanding and take the power of these words away. That's what a lot of this is about. Last point that I want to make, and I think it just needs to be said, when we think about issues of security and when we think about living in a democratic society, we have to double down in our appreciation and valuing of the law enforcement community in America. These are heroes among us each and every day. And to my mind, as important as it was for AJC to encourage people of all backgrounds to display their Jewish identity proudly and to convey it and to express it through social media, you know, it's above my pay grade. But if I was sitting at the top of AJC, I would have also encouraged our rank and file to walk into our local police precinct, ask who the duty officer is, introduce yourself, and thank them. Thank them for protecting and supporting and understanding and being there for their fellow Americans of the Jewish faith. That's really what so much of this is about in terms of building community. And there is a commonality with the belief that we put, the faith that we put in the power of law enforcement to protect us. And we have to give back to that community as well. We have a lot of challenge ahead of us in 2020, but we should not shirk one iota from our eternal sense of optimism and hope for a better world.
I want to thank Stephen and Richard for this evening. Thank you so very much. And thank my colleagues here at VBS for helping us put this together. A very last word, which is a reiteration of what you've heard. I hear it from everybody. And what disturbs me most, frankly, are people who have a tremendous sense of crisis, who scream in my face, this is 1937 and this is Germany. Let me tell you what happened the day after the Muncie attack. 2 things happened. First, I got a dozen emails from faith leaders around the community who I know well, who offered their support and their protection. From Christians, from Muslims, from members of other faiths who said, do you want us to come and watch the temple for you? We have members who were willing to come and watch the shul to make sure that you're okay. And I wrote back and said, thank you, that's amazing. We're okay. And the other thing that happened is that the police department started coming by every 15 minutes, right? Which meant that if you parked in the wrong place, you're in big trouble. But we stopped, and the cops would stop, and they talked to us, and we actually sent a basket of muffins over to the police department just to say thank you for paying attention. The reason why it's not 1937 and it's not Germany is that we have friends and we have allies, and that the vast majority of the American democracy is on the side of tolerance and welcome. And don't forget that. And we have to maintain that. We have to cultivate it. But don't forget that. That's who we are. That the haters are a tiny minority in this culture. They scare the hell out of us. It's no question. And I recognize that fear that comes along with that. I understand that. So we hardened the targets. So the walls are bigger, and there's cameras, and there's guards, and the police are here. We hardened the target to make the synagogue a safer place for us all. But that doesn't mean that we have to walk around in fear. The problem with walking around with a sense of crisis is, number one, it prevents you from thinking clearly and responding clearly. Number two, it prevents you from thinking long term. What we've heard tonight is that we have to take very seriously the texture of our democracy, the character of our conversations with each other, the character of democratic discourse. And we have to protect it. We can't take it for granted anymore. We have to protect the language of tolerance and welcome. We have to protect the language of inclusion and belonging. We have to protect that part of our democracy. And any time it's been violated, we have to call it out. And we have to be good about it. We have to call it out. Because we depend upon, our welcome here depends upon the health of this democracy. And it has made, this crisis, as it were, has made us aware of that. But instead of walking around with a sense of heated crisis, we have to think of this as a long-term process of rebuilding alliances, of creating connections, and of sustaining each other. And the very last thing is something I said on Rosh Hashanah, and I've said it 1,000 times, and so has every other rabbi that you know. Once you get past the gate with the guards, the quality of life within the Jewish community is ours to decide. Let it be joyful, let it be hopeful, let it be filled with sweetness and a song, and in some strange way, that's the best answer. The best answer is we so value our Jewishness that nothing, no amount of hate would ever compromise that. Thanks for coming tonight. We'll see you next week.
Thank you guys. That was good. Really, really good. Really, really good. Now you're going to get a barrage. Don't you think that's... But I wanted to spare you that.